I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Okay, welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. This is a very timely episode for us. We're heading into September. You may or may not be going back to school. I've even seen it circulating online. People are calling this Adult New Year's, which I quite like that term. I think I'm going to borrow. I'm joined today by a colleague and guest and friend, Dr. Emily Bennett. Emily, thank you so much for spending some time with us today on the podcast. We're going to talk all about habits, high performance habits, and resiliency building. Your practice is in Hamilton, Ontario. I'm going to let you kind of walk us through. I'd love to learn sort of how you got to this place as far as like your research and understanding of habit forming, and then how you use that in practice. Can you just walk us through your journey and hello, like introduce yourself?
Yeah, I feel very excited to be talking to you about this myself right now, because I think in sort of like habits and resiliency building is an interest of mine personally. It's something that I focus on in my practice, but it's also something that I'm really looking at critically for myself right now, just like you said, as we transition into this weird new September situation in the school year. I do think for me, it makes sense to sort of start with how I just a little bit about how I came to become a naturopathic doctor. I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome many years ago, and it's the thing that led me to see my first naturopath and then just kind of redirect the career path I was taking and go to naturopathic medical school myself. But a big part of finding long-term balance in that diagnosis for me went really far beyond looking at, the basics of supplements or diet or movement, and instead just getting really deeply attuned to how things made me feel. And I think a part of what impacts our ability to be resilient in the face of hard times are the quiet ways that we maybe are ignoring messages from our body, just doing things that we do out of habit, things that we do all the time that maybe are making us feel poorly, but we just are ignoring that feeling. Yeah. So in my clinical practice, I find that when we start talking about habits, people are thinking about it in terms of good habits and bad habits. They're thinking, like I have this good habit where I do wake up and make my bed every morning, but then I have all these bad habits, like I'm on my phone all night and I order out food all the time and I throw my dirty socks on the floor before bed, etc. But I think what we don't realize is that so much of our day, almost over 40% of our day, is spent in these habitual behaviors. And what habits really are is just this moment where we're not consciously engaging in a process of decision making. We're just removing ourselves from that necessity to do so. Habits can be magical because they persist despite our like conscious intentions to maybe do otherwise. And so on the one hand, when we're thinking about that in terms of things that don't serve us, it's a bummer, because you do reach over to your phone and pick it up and spend all night scrolling instead of going to bed when you know you should. But on the other hand, if we sort of engage with this possibility of tapping into being able to do things without putting energy towards that, then we could really use that to our advantage and use that to build resilience and take some decisions off our plate, which would be really helpful right now, especially, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because the way that you put that, right, that it could be quite a positive thing. I think I noticed that, I noticed two things as you were talking there, that quite often I will have women in my office describe their behaviors as bad habits, right? I think that's a common phrase that we use to describe things. And that almost, I don't want to say it absolves us from the responsibility, but it's almost like they're happening to us, right? Versus, having complete ownership over them. And then it also sort of acknowledges that piece about sort of running on autopilot, which I do think lots of women can identify with, right? That they feel like so much of their day is almost prescribed to them. It's something they have to do. It's a vortex that they're kind of in. And often those habits are part of that autopilot. I have so much decision fatigue from being, a boss all day that by the time I have to think about dinner, that's not possible. Therefore, we have X, right? But I love that concept of thinking about how to leverage it, right? Because I don't think we talk about good habits in such a positive light, or that autopilot as being a positive thing. Whereas, as you were talking there, I was thinking about, the things that you can pull off when things get really bad, right?
Wow.
And what does that look like? Because probably we have these, little small pieces that we are accomplishing really well that maybe we can leverage as to become something bigger, right? To like make it grow into something more positive.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. And I think, when I want someone to kind of get in touch with this idea that maybe they have that more of what they're doing in their day is happening out of habit than just these things they're identifying as good or bad. It can be helpful to look to a time where we do tend to, be fatigued in general. Like looking towards the evening can be a really helpful time to sort of examine what it feels like for you to act out of habit. Because because we're so removed consciously from our habitual behaviors, most of the time we just don't even realize that we're doing them out of habit or that they are a habit. And so because most of us, by the end of the day, we've been working all day, we've been shuttling kids all over the place, we've made dinner, we've cleaned up. And then you have this moment where you finally get to sit down and relax, even if it's just for a second before you dive into some other kind of work. That's a time where a habit is like, you're most likely to engage in habitual behavior. And I think that, if we are looking for opportunities to not be more productive by choosing more productive habits, but to just feel better. That these moments where we are indulging in a habit of relaxation, that's a great time to check in and say, ooh, how does this make me feel right now? Like, does it actually feel good to do whatever it is in those moments? Watch TV or whatever the habit is, because it can be leveraged. A habit is just a behavior that you have repeated enough in a certain context that it can slowly leave the conscious realm of you deciding to do it, and then just become something you're doing automatic. A habit is just something that is an automatic behavior that you engage in. And so, there are ways that we can have input on that by, using the things we know about habit formation to our advantage, and use them to help us feel better. Yeah.
So how does that happen, right? Like, and I'm curious about that because, I'd love to know, because I certainly I struggle with some of these like very habits too, which I think this is why this is such a cool conversation. But then I have some like very, very positive habits, right? Like I could be at my worst PMS crying and still make my lunch before I leave the house, right? Like, because it's like, and I actually even did a webinar for this for our women's health group where I showed them how I can make my lunch in 9 minutes. Breakfast, lunch, snack, shake, 9 minutes. It's completely autopilot. All the bags are there, all the things. And I could be at my literal worst. I never get skip the dishes at work, right? It just is not part of like what happens because the habit is so ingrained, right? The ingredients are always in the fridge, right? Even if I've had the worst week ever, they're still in there, right? Even if I never consciously thought, oh, I'm almost out of Greek yogurt, I better get some more. It's just in there, right? So I think this is such a cool conversation, but I don't know, like I wasn't consciously aware of like, how did that happen, right? Because I wasn't always successful at that. How did that happen? How did that translate? So what's the biology there? What's the research there about how we actually turn something into a habit? We've all heard that it takes 21 days to form a habit or whatnot. Like, how true is that? And what does habit building actually look like?
Yeah. So a lot of my like kind of initial interest in habits came out of reading Wendy Wood's book, Good Habits, Bad Habits. It's really great. I really recommend it if you're interested in sort of like the evidence kind of behind what's going on with the habit. The first thing that I hate to tell you is that apparently the 21-day thing is not true at all. and that on average, it's something more like 40 days to truly get something to this place of habit, but it changes depending on what we're talking about. I actually have some numbers that I had written down from before because I had a feeling this would come up as it does. But like if you look at something like changing your diet in a way, like you're moving to, let's say, having a smoothie regularly or trying to eat more vegetables, something like that, the research shows that it's taking on average 65 days, so over 2 months, to kind of get it to that place where it's happening with ease of the habit. And exercise is even longer. It's over 3 months, 91 days before we see, that like, going to yoga 3 times a week becomes a habit for you. It takes a really long time of doing that before you're not having to consciously remember to bring your yoga mat to work or whatever. But there are, so a part of her research has kind of boiled down into these sort of 3 areas that we can look to leverage in order to turn a behavior into a habit. And I have found them relatively easy to apply, just in the way that she's kind of broken it down. So the 3 things are your context and environment, in which both the like habit you want to change is happening and the habit that you want to implement could be happening. You want to think about repetition, of course, that's the main thing. And then reward actually plays a really big part in turning that behavior into a habit by sort of, working with the dopamine fix that you get when you do something you want to do and then are rewarded for it in some way. So like, just to stay with the context environment piece, I think that like, you described already, the ingredients are there. They're always there, no matter the kind of day you've had to make your lunch. And that's all about the context environment. You've set yourself up to succeed. You have decreased friction to completing that task by having everything there and ready to go. And so, I think inherently a lot of us know that, like if we're trying to develop a habit of writing in our journal regularly, people will go and buy a nice new journal. They'll buy a new pen that writes exactly the way they want it to, and they'll keep it on their bedside table. And for a while, they'll write in their journal, and they change the context in some way. If the plan is to journal before bed, they see their journal on their bedside table before bed, and so that is a cue to engage in the behavior. And over time, modifying your context to decrease the friction towards that behavior shows that it makes it easier to form it into a habit. You can also increase friction as well, just like we were saying, like if it is something like dietary that you're hoping to change, if you are feeling like, gosh, I don't want to always be relying on rice as a part of my meal, every meal. Well, you can increase friction by not buying rice next time you're at the grocery store. It's harder. And then what are you going to do? You have to come up with another option. So context and environment is this first piece. Repetition, we talked about, it takes a lot of repeating. And so you've got to you can keep refining your context and environment to encourage you to do it again, because you have to stick with it for probably more than 21 days, probably more like a month and a half for most behaviors, for it to sort of start linking up in your brain and becoming a habit. And then the reward piece is kind of interesting too, because, they've looked at both, whether we're talking about an intrinsic reward from the behavior or an extrinsic reward. Both can be beneficial. The intrinsic reward tends to be more beneficial, but because it's dopamine that sort of links the behavior and the reward and then makes it stick in our brains to help turn it into a habit, the reward needs to happen immediately. The dopamine fix that you get from the behavior is only coming right away. And so you can't have a reward that's coming to you in the distance. Saying that you'll go on a trip if you do this thing multiple times is not really going to be enough. It's not a good enough reward to actually encourage the behavior and leverage the dopamine piece. It's got to be something that's happening right away. So intrinsically, something like if you want to pick up a habit of running, then you want to find some way to remind yourself to, after you're done your run, just soak up that feeling of whatever feels good about running. Like to really soak up that feeling for a second of like the runner's high, or feeling your blood pumping through your body, or whatever it is that feels good to you about running. You got to take a moment and enjoy that as your reward, your intrinsic reward for running. And then extrinsically, you can do something like, let's try to use the example of running again. Like if there's some kind of thing that you want to be able to do after you run, you can link it to something like, I will watch my favorite TV show, after I go for this run this evening. That's an extrinsic reward. So you can run, sit and enjoy the runner's high, and then be like, now I'll go in and watch my favorite show. And both those things are helping to turn that behavior into a habit over time. And it's good to leverage both of them, both that intrinsic and extrinsic reward.
I like those examples, because most of the things that we're trying to maybe decrease as habits, just like they inherently have that sort of dopaminergic like aspect to them, right? Like the cookie or the cigarette or the glass of wine or the whatever it is, right? Their reward is like very immediate for a lot of those things. Whereas when we're talking about health habits, we say like saving money is way easier than changing your diet, right? Or trying to lose weight or doing something that takes like persistent repetition, because the gold star or the outcome is happening way further down the line. And so I like those ideas of like trying to create some more immediate feedback loops. I want to come back to just the noticing piece, because I think that's something that maybe when we talk about healthcare and some of the gaps, like that's one of those pieces is just having patients like notice what's going on with their own body. But when I describe that to patients, that if we said, okay, like, Jordan, you got to save 200 bucks, like go, right? You would not buy a latte and put the $4 in the jar, right? Work a little harder, put the money in the jar. And at the end of the week, if you had $86, it would make total sense why you didn't have 200 and how you were almost there, right? Whereas with so many health goals, we're asking people to like make these deposits they can't see, feel, hear, or anything. And they eat their 5 salads, they get on the scale and nothing has happened, right? And that's so difficult, because how on earth do we get them to show up the following week? Right? And still do it when, I like your friction word, right? There's a lot of friction to choose the salad and not the cookie, because these delayed gratification is so difficult for humans. We're just not wired that way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think, from the perspective of like what are we maybe missing as healthcare practitioners in terms of supporting our patients to develop the habits that they desire or the habits that we're recommending for them. And I think it is this like moment of body attunement. Like before we maybe push somebody into acting out a certain behavior, it might be imperative that we say, you need to spend a week. I just want you to tune in how it feels when you do this behavior that we want to change, so that you develop the ability to check into that possible intrinsic reward of eating a big salad with it. I mean, yeah, runner's high is maybe easier than the intrinsic reward of just eating a salad. But yeah, to make time that we take that for that, to make time for helping people develop that opportunity for body attunement, because I think that we rush into being like, change the behavior. But if you're not going to notice the impact of the behavior change because all you have is this long-term outcome you're looking for, like, yeah, maybe it is to like have to change your energy during the day or to have less panic attacks or whatever. But if you can be more in touch with those incremental shifts, then it's going to allow you to feel hopefully more empowered to stick with the work. Because it does take work. Regardless, we're still talking about needing to repeat in order to see it become a habit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I use the word notice all the time with patients. And even this, I talked about this in just like not that long ago in a podcast episode. But, I'll often ask patients after, even in their first visit when we're just first meeting with each other, but often in subsequent appointments, I'll say, well, what did you notice, right? Like, what did you notice about your sleep? What did you notice about your diet or your appetite or your cravings? And at first, they're often like, well, what do you mean? What did I notice? I didn't notice anything, right? I had the smoothie. I didn't notice anything. And it takes like this like active process to actually be like, okay, well, you also noted that you're not eating after dinner anymore. Like, can you notice, right? Those. And so sometimes I think we're having to like almost take some pretty baby steps as far as, making those connections between our behavior and how we feel, because the sort of that autopilot North American burned out woman is not always drawing those conclusions on her own, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's extremely. We're very head centric. We're very disconnected a lot of the time from how we feel in our bodies, and part of that is because we always have something on our minds that we're potentially responsible for. And I think that there's so much value in bringing a somatic piece into the idea of checking in the idea of like preparing to make a behavior change. To like maybe we should always. I know that that's perhaps a hard sell. People like show up and they want results quickly, and that's not always possible for them. But developing that ability early on of connecting, how just taking a pause, naming how you feel, and then finding in your body where are you kind of what's happening physically for you in that moment too. Like you are thinking about all you have to do in order to get your work done today, make dinner, get the kids to bed, whatever, and you're going over your to-do list and you just are moving super quick. Can you pause for a moment and just name what you're feeling in that moment? Like, irritated because I'm responsible for all of this right now. And then take a second moment to say, okay, like, what am I feeling in my body in this moment that I'm irritated? I'm feeling, I have really tense shoulders and like, whatever it is. And that is that's the mindfulness practice. That's the point of meditation, is like to strengthen that ability to check into what's going on with ourselves. And that's, we begin to kind of develop that habit, then forming all the other habits will be easier, because you'll have the ability to kind of check into that incremental change that will happen along the way. It's not really glamorous, but I think it pays back in a huge way when we begin to know that, when we begin to make space for that, for a pause and a check-in.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because if I contrast that to a lot of, maybe what people see online about habits, and even would maybe drew them to listen to the episode, right? Like, oh, I need to figure out what the life hacks are so that I can be more successful and more productive. That it often gets presented as this sort of like glamorous, like, the CEO morning routine, and so much about the habit discussion right now is around productivity and success, right? But maybe not in the way that you and I would define success, maybe in the way that, like, we're talking about like monetary success or whatnot, right? And I think that it's interesting because that's, and I'll use it as a kind of a funny example, but women will say like, well, I just have to recover from this burnout like as quickly as possible. Right. and almost like we need to, like, I got to figure out which habits is going to, totally help my burnout, when that's really missing the point, right? That so much of like what the goals are, like you mentioned, is how do we, what is that relaxation? What are the habits in that relaxation time? Actually, it's not about if you get up 5 minutes earlier and do 10 stretches before you go to work, that you're going to be twice as productive and make more money. Right? Like that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about habits. We're like, how do we have a healthier, happier, more resilient human being, which is not about those things.
Yeah. And I mean, it could potentially lead to those things. Like
sure.
if you can free up space to be able to just focus on the task at hand when you are dealing with the task at hand, it probably is going to ultimately improve your productivity in some way and maybe lead to whatever else you're looking for, increased monetary, whatever. But I think that the secret might be that actually you should, look to your habits of relaxation. Maybe the first habit you need to develop is a habit of doing nothing. Do you leave space for any time in your life to literally just sit on your front porch without your phone and stare into your street and just practice doing nothing? Because, like for most women who are super busy, who are maybe trying to recover from burnout, who feel like the responsibilities are unending, there is literally zero time in their day where they're doing nothing and just giving themselves a break. And it doesn't have to be more than 5-10 minutes, but like, could you start with it? I think if you start with that, it's going to free up space for you to do other things. It's going to give you the strength to engage in the things that perhaps that you're expecting to do, working out in the morning before work or going to bed earlier, or these things that feel too difficult right now because you've really got too much to do. And you just give yourself a break as the first habit that might be that step you need to take in order to get to that place of feeling resilient and recovering from burnout. I'm very pro nothing. If people are saying to me, I'm very pro nothing. If they're like, I think I need to be meditating, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what about just doing nothing? What about just sitting without a plan and just looking off into the distance, giving your eyes a rest instead of staring at a screen or whatever? Just look off into the distance for a bit and see how that makes you feel. Just make a note after. How do you feel before and after doing something like that? And like, we can talk about getting to meditation, but like, what about just trying nothing for a moment first? Because there's a lower bar to entry also, just sit.
Yes. Yeah, I like that because, and one of the questions I had for you was like, and this is what I was thinking, because I'm not particularly successful at doing all these habits all the time, every day, is that, and with this whole concept around like wellness perfectionism, I'm going to call it, where, when people often approach habit change, approach dietary change and whatnot with respect to wellness, it's like this very black or white, doing it perfectly, totally messing it up. And I think I see that potential in this conversation around habits, right? If we're saying, well, it takes 75 days of making a smoothie in order for you to be successful. Like what happens if like day 23 you run out of frozen blueberries and that's it, right? Or they don't have your favorite protein powder at the grocery store and you have to wait a week for it to come in.
Mhm.
A, if we lost ground, but B, like, I think maybe communicating that even being kind of unsuccessful at it is still so positive, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Every time you do the behavior, you strengthen that neural pathway and you get closer to turning that behavior into a habit. So if you do the thing 3 times and then you miss the next 5 times, that's okay. You've not lost ground. You're ready to keep going with this project of turning this behavior into a habit when you're ready again. And so, it's something that just makes me feel so bad when patients come in and they were like, I started the elimination diet and then I ate something with soy sauce. And so I've given up. I've got to start over. I just threw in the towel, whatever. And I mean, it's just not the case. You can return. You haven't lost everything just because you've stopped for a couple of days or you've taken a misstep or whatever. It's going to happen. Nothing is black and white. We are always just wading through the gray. And so you're not going to do this perfectly. But what is perfection anyways? What is the point of perfection? Let's just focus on, feeling good about what we have done, looking for the reward in the steps we've taken already and being gentle with ourselves and knowing that you'll get back on. You'll buy blueberries again and make a smoothie. You just have to go grocery shopping. No problem.
I know you talk quite a bit about shame in a lot of your social media content and whatnot, and it kind of brings this up, right? It's this idea that like if we're unsuccessful, we now feel badly about it, versus using that as a moment where we can actually reflect on like, okay, well, I'm supposed to meditate and that didn't happen. Like, how come, right? And we can start to actually notice under what circumstances we are successful at those habits and what's instances we're not. If you have a coffee on your way home from work, there's no way in hell you're meditating when you get home, right? Like, but we have a hard time drawing those conclusions when we don't have that introspection around how we feel and how our day, like what the pieces that we control are that are stacking up in a way that helps us be successful or not successful. But also when we beat ourselves up for the misstep, right, we lose the learning opportunity in it, right? Where I know there's tons of examples online of like talking about toddlers and whatnot. I know if they fell once, would we say, oh, that's it, don't walk ever? But it's the same kind of idea, right? That like when we have a big misstep, or let's say, things turn into a massive dumpster fire for 3 months, acknowledging it and recognizing under what circumstances did that show, like, how did that happen for you? How did you get yourself there? And then using that to prevent further dumpster fires, right? But when we're in this cycle of like continuous, having shame around not being able to execute and then like momentarily being able to execute everything, it's really difficult. But I know you talk so much about this. I love listening to your conversations online about shame. And I know that probably could be an entire podcast episode all on its own. But tell me, like, how does it relate to the habits? Can we loop it into this conversation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, one thing to acknowledge first is that we are often thinking about changing our behaviors because of outside influence, right? We're not checking into ourselves and being like, I think that will feel like a better fit for me. We're kind of receiving the information from like the wild world of diet culture or, our friend who is a fitness expert or whatever. And we're being told that this is what's right and what we're doing is wrong. And again, that's this black and white thing it just isn't the case. What is right for you, obviously, is not necessarily what's right for somebody else. And I think that when shame comes into it, it's because we're trying to fit ourselves a lot of the time into a mold that doesn't fit for us, or we're taking in this information as if it's something we are being told to do when it's not the right fit for us. I think that when we're thinking about this idea of developing body attunement and using that to kind of guide us to the habits that are going to work best for us, that are going to yield well-being, that are going to yield resiliency and just kind of like enjoyment for our life. A part of what we don't learn from the media around us is self-compassion. self-compassion is this thing you really have to dig into and build for yourself for most of us. Like most people are not raised in homes and communities where that's kind of the guiding principle of growth, is like learning how to be compassionate for yourself when you do fail, or when you do yell at your toddler, or when you do, you just, we take that black and white and we apply it everywhere. Like, not only is this behavior good and this behavior is bad, but I am good because I did this behavior, and I am bad because I didn't do it, or I did something else. And I mean, like, just like you said, everything is happening in the context of your life, and we need to be compassionate with ourselves and reflect back on that in order to find the possibility of learning and, yeah, be able to move forward from that point. I've kind of strayed from shame, but in this conversation.
Yeah, but it's helpful, because I think even too, like when we break it down into something as simple as, like, I'm going to use like meditation after work, because this was a personal example that I can relate to. I used to have a horrific time picking my kids up from work, so I'd like work this crazy clinical day. If I was like 5 minutes behind, I was going to be late to pick the kids up from school. I had to like mic drop at the end of the day, bust it out of work, and then you'd pick them up, and then like, I'm hungry, they're crying, they've lost all their stuff. They're opening their lunches in the backseat of my car, and everything's going everywhere. They're fighting, I'm crying. Like, and this happened 3 days a week, right? Like it was this vortex that I couldn't get out of. And so I started meditating after work, and I actually put an alert in my phone that said, you need to calm down, right? Like it went off at like 5:20, because that's when I would get home. It was like, you need to calm down, Jordan. And I had to go lie in my bed for 10 minutes and just lie there and be like, the world is not ending. You didn't eat enough. You had too much coffee. The kids are just tired. They can watch TV. It's fine. The world is not ending. And I was pretty consistent with it for a few months, to actually like listen to my phone. And it sounds like such a simple little thing, right? But trying to build that in. But what that actually turned into was me recognizing how destructive all of those patterns of behavior were, and then build the bravery and assertiveness to say, I can't pick the kids up from school on a day I work.
Cool. That's awesome.
Right. And so it took like a year and a half for that to actually come to fruition. Right. And I always say to my patients, like, I know you can't quit your job today. Like, that's not, but if we start to look at like all the destruction that's coming from all of those things, right? There's a lot rooted in some of those really big parts of our lives that maybe feel immovable right now, but becoming more well and becoming more resilient and becoming more assertive may let you actually change those big, big chess pieces later.
Yeah,
right? And it was only when I was like, I have to lie down every day because this is completely unmanageable, to recognize how to assert myself in a way that like created a better scenario. And now I don't pick my kids up from school.
Love it. I think too, what you saying that is reminding me about is that the habit is not the end goal, right? You're thinking like, maybe I modify my behavior and try to form it into a habit because I want to, whatever. I want to feel more at peace when I have to go pick my kids up at school. And as you got to that place of creating peace, when you got home from, when you took that moment to lie down in your bed, you realize what the actual problem is. The actual problem is not that I'm like an angry mom when I pick my kids up.
Monster mom. Yeah.
The problem is something else needs to shift. This doesn't fit for me. And like, that wasn't available to you beforehand because you were all in your head. You were all just like, I have to do this. All these things need to be taken care of by me. End of story. And so the habit doesn't have to be the end goal. And I think that, as a member of a person's health team, you can maybe help them see that as you work together. You can even kind of lay that out for them, saying, we expect that this is going to create space for you to whatever, take a breath at the end of your day and hope, and that should in turn kind of allow you to fall asleep with more ease. And then once you're doing that, I expect that you will be able to talk to your boss because you won't be so triggered and then your life can change or whatever it is. And that we can kind of, as that outsider, give some perspective and kind of like paint a picture of why you might engage in this habit. It's not because you need to have this habit. Like, you don't need to meditate after work every day. Like, that's not something you have to do, but it was a tool to get you to that place where you could make the change that needed to happen in order to increase your resilience and your sense of well-being. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Example.
So, like, what do you feel like your big message is for our women and parents in our September piece? And I'd love to know, like, and I know we've talked pretty specifically about like how there are no specific habits. Like, we can't create a top 10 list. But if we were to create a top 10 list of things that I think people could be wary of or notice going back to work and school and all of that in September, I'd love for us to try. To give some sort of take home thoughts about what to implement over the next couple of months. What do you feel like is like your big message? And I also would love to know how people can get a hold of you, because I know you do lots of work on this and you've got an online program and all of that coming up around resiliency and habit building. I think I just asked you like 10 questions in one.
I think I can remember most of them.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you try.
Exciting. Yeah. Okay. So take home, the overriding message and take home. I would say first, the overriding message that I've already said, but I'll just say it again, is perhaps the habit you need to develop is a habit of doing nothing. And so I just want that to sit with people and think about it. Do you have any moment in your day where you just sit down and do nothing for a moment? You're not like, oh, I'm going to take a load off and scroll on Instagram. No. You just sit and you do nothing for a moment. And so just to take that and think about it for a moment. And then in terms of like, tangible next steps, I will really encourage people to look to their evenings. If you have kids, if you are the person who's making dinner or cleaning up or whatever, after you're done those tasks in the evening, just try to take a couple of days where maybe you do time track for a bit and you see how you spend your time after that's happened. What do you do after the kids go to bed? Just write down exactly what happens. I flop down on my couch. I pick up my phone. I spend 35 minutes on Instagram. Then I open my computer. I watch an episode of Indian matchmaking. Whatever. That was what I did last night. And you just write it all out. And that's the first step, like pay attention to what you're doing for a second. And you don't actually have to pay attention to it in that moment. Just start by writing it down. And then over the next couple of days, try to kind of start implementing that tool of reflection and check in to how you feel in the evening. Like, what does it feel like in your body when you're on Instagram? And just write that down next to where you wrote down your time, you tracked your time. And as you do that, you'll have something you can look at and say, isn't that funny? Like, when I spend X amount of time in front of a screen before bed, it takes me 45 minutes to fall asleep. Maybe that's a habit that I could work on shifting. And it will, bring to your awareness something small, probably. And because so much of what we do in the evening, it affects, how we feel, how our sleep is, and how our sleep affects how we feel the next day. I mean, it's just it's like the gold mine to look at your evening first, to find that easy thing that you can shift. And it might really be something small. It might be about, like putting off decision making in the evening, like have hard conversations on the weekend. If you notice that when you have like a conversation about what to do about whatever with your husband, then maybe that's something you should be putting off into the weekend if you find that it affects your sleep, for example. So time track in the evening and then go through this process of just writing down how it feels to do each of those things that you spend your evening on. Is that good? Is that a good takeaway?
I love it. Yeah, those are great takeaways. Yeah. Because I think that brings in sort of like that noticing piece, right? And sometimes time tracking, even just on its own, can be so powerful. One of the things that I just shared in my Instagram story is one of my good habits is just delegation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's like something that automatically comes to me as a habit. Like, do I have to do this, or can some other person do this?
Yeah.
But I still have to, like, every 6 months sit down and write down all the stuff I'm doing, because it turns out like so much of it is not necessary, not urgent, made up deadlines, right? And I think, but unless we actually sit down and check in with that, but I love connecting that with how you feel, right? Because I think that's one of the big missing pieces in long-term sustainability for any health change, is that we're not connected enough with what that does for us, or the goal that we have is not what we thought, not as fun or as cool as we thought it would be once we landed there, right? Or all of those things. But sort of checking in with like how that actually makes us feel in that moment is kind of this lost art that I'm always encouraging women to get better connected to, because then the decision making becomes easier, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is way less, I love your word friction. I'm borrowing that forever. There's
Mm-hmm.
way less friction if you can say like choice A, and I know that I'm going to feel like garbage and be monster mom tomorrow. Whereas choice B of going to bed a little bit earlier is a very positive thing for me. The answer gets a little easier, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
When you've like gotten into this habit of practicing body attunement, checking into how you feel, it can be kind of like I want to use an expression and I know that it's not right, so I'm just not going to use it. But it can be like a little warning signal, if you find that you feel anxious in the evening and you go through this process of changing your behavior and hopefully turning into a habit, and that goes away, you have, in that practice become attuned to the feeling of you being anxious. And so when it comes back, you can say, oh, what's going on right now? Like, I notice I'm feeling anxious a bunch again. My evenings are spent feeling anxious when I had moved past this. Like, what has shifted? What has changed? What's not working for me right now? And it just is going to, like, building that practice of being attuned to how you feel when you are engaging in behaviors is just going to pay back 1,000 times. So just keep using that again and again if you make that a habit in itself. And so, yeah, so into that, so into the checking into how you're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so important. I love it. And how can we get in touch with you? So everyone should just follow you on Instagram, because I feel like the content you share is brilliant. It's one of my favorite accounts to follow, Emily.
Cool.
But how else can we get in touch with you, and what do you offer to help support people who are looking at, maybe they know they have some habits that they need to shift, or maybe they don't even know where to start, right? And need more support. How can we connect?
So I'm really excited because I'm running this challenge beginning mid-September, September 14th, where I've created just like a little program that I'm going to put myself through at the same time too, on figuring out like where to begin with changing habits and how we can go about kind of setting up all these things that we talked about today, like really digging into the idea of like modifying the environment so that it supports what you want to do and moves you away from what you don't want to do. Looking at how to stay focused on repetition, figuring out what rewards make sense so that you can really turn a behavior into a habit. And it's full of lots of great journal prompts. It's free. And if you're interested, you can sign up at habits.dremilybennett.com. And Bennett has 2 N's and 2 T's.
Awesome. Well, we'll put the link to that right in the show notes, so you can jump to it right from however you're listening to the podcast, as well as your Instagram, because I'm just going to push your Instagram because I feel like that's where people need to go. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me today, Emily. I so appreciate I love all the work that you do on shame, because I feel like that's, the more I work with women, the more I realize that so much of what we have to do is unlearning. And so many of these, I'm going to call them like thought habits around what our rules are and all of these things, right? And I feel like I'm so grateful for your contribution in the online space and this discussion today. So thank you so much for spending time with us.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Jordan.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.